Hi, I'm MTG, and welcome to another episode of Good Clean Commander. We have a very special pod for you today because we're playing all Lulu. All of us are rocking a Lulu with a different background. So, this is something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time because it is just a very silly concept to me. So, super excited to show you the gameplay. But before we jump in, I just want to give a huge thank you to two content creators that we had on, which is BenjitheBrewer and MTGGnome. You can see their details to their channels down below. Highly recommend checking out both of them. Benji does some really cool deck brewing stuff for Commander, and then is trying to get some Commander gameplay going as well on Twitch, and then on YouTube. MTGGnome makes incredible historic brawl content, is a very smart player, and just highly recommend going to check out both of their channels. So again, I'll make sure I put the details in the description down below. And for our other guests, we have Ginger, who's part of the Good Clean Commander crew, and you've probably seen them in some other awesome games. So anyways, let's go check out the gameplay, and let's have a good clean game. Ginger is playing Lulu Loyal Holophant with a Clan Crafter background. Her deck is an Azorius artifact deck looking to flood the battlefield with artifact creatures, and to sacrifice them to gain overwhelming value. And in her starting hand, she has a Misty Rainforest, Urza's Saga, Giver of Ruins, Bronze Walrus, Lion Sash, Scrap Trawler, and Scholar of New Horizons. Benji is playing Lulu Loyal Holophant as well, but with the Guild Artisan background. This Boros deck leans into making treasure tokens to cash them in and drop big threats. And in his starting hand, Benji has 2 mountains, a plains, Needle Verge Pathway, Boros Garrison, Mog Salvage, and a Professional Facebreaker. I am playing Lulu with a Criminal Past background. My deck is a budget Voltron deck, and no card in the deck is over $2.50, with the total value being under $50 at the time of this recording. And in my starting hand, I have a Talisman of Hierarchy, Great Hall of Starnheim, Felsteiner, Wayfarer's Bauble, Open the Armory, Bajuka Bog, and an Ash Barrens. MTGGnome is playing Lulu with the Dragon Cultist background. His deck is a Boros Voltron deck looking to suit up his commander and deal enough damage to build up his dragon token army. And in his starting hand, he has a Mountain, Buried Ruin, Felwar Stone, Dowsing Dagger, All That Glitters, by Force, and an Astor, Bearer of Blades. Ginger starts us off by drawing and playing a Misty Rainforest. She then sacrifices it to fetch a Glacial Floodplain and puts the floodplain onto the battlefield tapped. Ginger then passes her turn to Benji. Benji draws and plays a mountain. Benji then passes to me. I draw and play a tapped Great Hall of Starnheim as my land for turn. I then pass to MTGGnome. MTGGnome draws and plays a mountain and then passes to Ginger. Ginger untaps, draws, and plays an Urza's Saga as her land for turn. Urza's Saga enters as an enchantment land with a lore counter on it. The first step in the saga lets Ginger tap Urza's Saga for a colorless mana. Ginger then follows that up by paying 2 for Scholar of New Horizons. Scholar enters with a +1/+1 counter, and Ginger then passes the turn to Benji. Benji draws and plays a Plains. He then pays 2 and casts a Treasure Map. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and I pay 1 to basic land cycle Ash Barrens and search my library for a basic Plains card, putting it into my hand. I then play the Plains card as my land for turn. I follow that up by paying 1 to cast a Wayfarer's Bauble. I then pass the turn to MTGGnome. Gnome draws and plays a Plains. He pays 2 for a Felwar Stone and then passes to Ginger. Ginger untaps, draws, and puts another lore counter on her Urza's Saga. This allows her to pay 2 and tap Urza's Saga to create a construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. She then plays a Prismatic Vista as her land for turn. Moving to combat, she swings the Scholar at Gnome. Unable to block, Gnome takes 2. In her second main phase, Ginger sacrifices her Prismatic Vista and fetches up a basic Plains, putting it onto the battlefield. She then follows that up by paying 3 for a Bronze Walrus. When Walrus enters the battlefield, Ginger scries 2, putting 1 card on the top of her library and the second on the bottom. Ginger then passes to Benji. Benji untaps and draws for turn. He then pays 1 and taps the treasure map to scry 1 card to the bottom and add a landmark counter to treasure map. He then plays a tapped Boros Garrison as land for turn. returning his mountain to hand. Benji then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a swamp. I then pay 2 for a Talisman of Hierarchy. Paying 2, I then crack my Wayfarer's Bauble and put a Plains onto the battlefield. I then pass the turn to Gnome. Gnome untaps, draws, and plays a Buried Ruin. He then pays 4 and casts his commander, Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant, being the first person to cast their commander. Gnome then passes the turn to Ginger. Ginger untaps and draws for turn. Urza's Saga now moves to its 3rd loyalty counter, so before Ginger sacrifices it, she pays 2 and taps the Saga to create a construct creature token. Urza's Saga is then sacrificed, and Ginger searches her library for a Soul Ring and puts it onto the battlefield. While searching for her Soul Ring, Ginger then taps her Scholar and removes a counter from it to fetch an Idyllic Beachfront, putting it onto the battlefield tapped. She then follows it up by playing a Plains as land for turn. Ginger then pays 4 to cast her own commander, Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant. Because a permanent left the battlefield during Ginger's turn, Lulu triggers at instep, and Ginger untaps her tapped creatures and puts a +1/+1 counter on each of them. She then passes the turn to Benji. Benji untaps, draws, and plays a mountain. He then pays 3 to cast a Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The saga enters at Chapter 1, and Benji makes a 2/2 Goblin Shaman token. He then pays 1, taps his treasure map, and scries, adding a landmark counter to the map. Benji then decides to leave the card on top of his library and passes the turn to me. I untap and draw for turn. I pay 2 for a Gorgon Flail. I then follow that up by paying 2 for an Open the Armory. This allows me to search my library for an aura or equipment card and put it in my hand. I find a Swiftfoot Boots and put it to hand. I then pass my turn. Gnome untaps, draws, and plays an Arid Mesa. He then cracks it to fetch up a Sacred Foundry and puts it into the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Gnome then pays 2 mana to cast a Dowsing Dagger. When Dowsing Dagger enters the battlefield, Gnome selects me to receive 2 0/2 plant creature tokens. Gnome then equips the Dowsing Dagger onto Lulu. Moving to combat, Gnome sends his newly equipped Elefante at me, and I take 5 damage in the air. Because the equipped creature dealt combat damage to a player, the Dowsing Dagger transforms into the Lost Veil, a land that can tap for 3 mana of any color. In his post-combat main phase, Gnome pays 4 to cast an Astor, Bearer of Blades. When an Astor enters the battlefield, its ETB triggers, and Gnome looks at the top 7 cards of his library. He can reveal an equipment or aura card from among them and put them into his hand. He reveals a Robe of Stars and puts the rest of the cards on the bottom of his library in random order. On end step, Ginger then taps her Scholar, removing its +1/+1 counter, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain, putting onto the battlefield tap. Gnome then passes the turn to Ginger. Ginger untaps and draws. She pays 4 for a Jiora's Familiar. Jiora's Familiar makes Ginger's historic spells cost 1 less to cast. Using the discount that she just earned, Ginger then pays 1 to cast her Background Clan Crafter. Moving to combat, Ginger sends her Lulu at Benji. Unable to block a flyer, Benji takes 3 commander damage. During her second main phase, Ginger pays 1 for a Lion Sash. She immediately pays 2 more and sacrifices Lion Sash to Clan Crafter. This gives her commander a +1/+1 counter, and Ginger draws a card. She then taps her Scholar and removes a counter from the Walrus to fetch up a Prairie Stream and puts it into her hand. She then plays Prairie Stream as her land for turn, which enters tapped. Moving to end step, Ginger's Lulu triggers, and Ginger untaps her creatures, putting a +1/+1 counter on them. She then passes to Benji. Benji untaps, draws, and moves to the second step of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which lets him discard up to 2 cards and draw that many cards if he does. He chooses to discard a mountain and draws a card. He then plays Needleverge Pathway as land for turn. Paying 3 for a Cursed Mirror, he has it enter as a copy of the Goblin Shaman token. Moving to combat, Benji swings his 2 goblins at me, and on attack, each goblin creates Benji a treasure token. I decide to block the 2 goblins with my 2 plants. During his second main phase, Benji pays 1 and taps his treasure map. He scries 1 to the bottom, and because treasure map has 3 landmark counters on it, it transforms into Treasure Cove, and Benji creates 3 treasures. Paying 4 to cast a Lulu of his own, Benji then moves to end step where Lulu triggers, and Benji untaps his 2 goblins and puts a +1/+1 counter on each of them. The turn then passes to me. I untap, draw, and play Command Tower. I pay 4 and cast Akaya's Wrath, destroying all creatures. Ginger responds by sacrificing her construct and removing a counter from Scholar to fetch a Plains to hand. I then pay 2 for Swiftfoot Boots and pass my turn. One quick note here is I thought Kaya's Wrath gave me a life for all creatures that died, but it's just my own that were destroyed, so I do fix my life total later. Just a heads up. Anyways, Gnome untaps, draws, and plays a mountain. He then follows it up by paying 2 to cast Annul the Forge Master. Floating 5 mana to cast a Lion Sash and Robe of Stars, he uses the remaining 3 mana to equip both the Robe and Lion Sash to Null. Gnome then passes the turn to Ginger. Ginger untaps and draws for turn. She pays 4 to cast a Crystalline Crawler, which enters with 2 counters. Ginger pays 1 and casts a Giver of Ruins. She follows that up by casting a Foundry Inspector for 3 mana. Ginger then plays a Plains' Land for turn and passes to Benji. Benji untaps, draws, and moves to the 3rd step on his Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, which is then exiled and returns to the battlefield as Reflections of Kiki Jiki. Benji then follows that up by playing an Arid Mesa Esseline for turn. He immediately cracks it to fetch up a Plains and put it onto the battlefield. He then recasts his commander, Lulu, and passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a Bojuka Bog as land for turn, targeting Ginger to exile her graveyard. I pay 4 to cast my own Evil, Lulu, and then pay 2 to equip them with the Gorgon's Flail. I then pass to Gnome. Gnome untaps and draws. He pays 1 to cast an Esper Sentinel. He then follows that up by paying 6 to recast his commander, Lulu. Paying 2, he then casts an All That Glitters and attempts to enchant his Esper Sentinel. While the glitter is on the stack, Benji casts a Mog Salvage, targeting Gnome's Esper Sentinel. It has no response, so the Sentinel is destroyed, and All That Glitter fizzles out without a legal target and goes to the graveyard. Deciding to skip combat, Gnome then passes the turn. Ginger untaps and draws. She decides to let her Lulu play with the other Lulu, so she recasts her commander as well. She then plays a Marsh Flats and immediately sacks it to fetch a Plains and puts it onto the battlefield. Using her creatures to help improvise the cost, Ginger then casts a Kappa Cannoneer. When the Cannoneer enters the battlefield, it puts a +1/+1 counter on itself because it is an artifact. Ginger then pays 1 for a Noble's Purse, putting it onto the battlefield tapped with 3 coin counters on it. This puts an additional +1/+1 counter on the Cannoneer. Ginger then decides to tap her Giver of Ruins to give Lulu protection from white. Moving to end step, Ginger's Lulu triggers, and Ginger untaps her creatures, putting a +1/+1 counter on them. Before passing the turn, Benji sacks a treasure to his treasure cove and draws a card. With no other actions, Benji then starts his turn by untapping and drawing. He then pays 2 to cast his background, Guild Artisan. Benji follows that up by paying 3 for a Professional Facebreaker. Then, paying 1, he taps his Reflection of Kiki Jiki to make a token copy of Facebreaker with haste. Moving to combat, Benji swings his Lulu at Ginger and his token copy of Facebreaker at me. Since Ginger has the highest life total, Benji's background triggers, giving him 2 treasure tokens. I declare no blocks, and Ginger blocks with her Lulu. In response to blocks, Ginger taps her Giver of Ruins to give her Lulu protection from white. Benji responds by paying 3 to Chaos Warp Ginger's commander. Lulu is sent back to the command zone, and Ginger reveals an island from the top of her library, putting it onto the battlefield. I take 2 damage, and both of Benji's Facebreakers trigger because combat damage was dealt to a player, giving him 2 treasures. Moving to end step, Benji's Lulu triggers, and he untaps his creatures and puts a +1/+1 counter on them. His token copy of Facebreaker must be sacrificed at end step. Benji then passes the turn to me. I untap and draw. I pay 3 to cast a Felsteiner. Choosing to have it exploit itself on ETB, I lose 2 life and draw 2 cards. I then follow that up and pay 2 for a Novice Occultist. Paying 1 to equip Swiftfoot Boots onto Lulu, she gains Hexproof, and I move to combat, sending Lulu at Gnome. Since my Lulu has Death Touch, Gnome decides not to block and takes 4 commander damage. In my untap step, Lulu triggers, and I untap them and add a +1/+1 counter. I then pass the turn to Gnome. Gnome untaps and draws. He pays 2 for a Lizard's Blades. He then follows that up by paying 5 to cast his background, Dragon Cultist. He reconfigures the Lizard Blades onto Lulu, giving them double strike. Gnome moves to combat and swings his newly equipped Lulu at Ginger. Unable to block, Ginger takes 6 commander damage. On end step, Gnome creates a 4/4 dragon thanks to his Dragon Cultist background. He then passes the turn to Ginger. Ginger untaps, draws, and plays an Inventor's Fairest Land for turn. Ginger then taps her Noble's Purse, giving her a treasure token and putting a +1/+1 counter on the now unblockable Kappa Cannoneer. Ginger then pays 8 to recast her commander Lulu. She sacrifices a treasure and taps a land to cast a scrap trawler, giving her cannoneer an additional counter. She then floats the mana and taps her crawler, giving it another counter, and immediately removes the counter for a white mana so she can cast a Selfless Spirit. Moving to combat, Ginger then sends the 8/8 unblockable cannoneer at Benji. Having no response, he takes the 8 damage. Ginger once again taps her Giver of Ruins to give Lulu protection from white. Moving end step, her Lulu triggers and Ginger untaps her creatures, putting a +1/+1 counter on them. She then passes to Benji. Benji untaps, draws, and plays a Plains' land for turn. He then pays 3 to blitz in a Riveteer's Requisitioner. Paying 3 to cast a Coastline Marauder, he follows that up by paying 1 and taps his Reflections of Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of the Marauders. Moving to combat, Benji sends his Requisitioner at me, his Lulu at Gnome, and the copy of Coastline Marauders at Ginger. Because Ginger has 10 lands, the Marauder is now a 10/3. On attack, Benji creates 2 treasure tokens thanks to his background. In response to attackers, Ginger sacrifices her Soul Ring to the Clan Crafter, drawing Ginger a card and puts a +1/+1 commander on her commander. Moving to blocks, I block the Requisitioner with my Novice Occultist, Gnome blocks the Lulu with his Dragon token, and Ginger blocks the Marauder with her Cannoneer. In response to blockers being declared, Benji sacrifices 4 treasures to flash in a Wandering Emperor. He then uses her +1 ability to put a +1/+1 counter on his Lulu and gives them first strike until end of turn. Before damage is dealt, Ginger taps her Giver of Ruins to give her Cannoneer protection from red until end of turn. Damage is dealt, and my Novice Occultist dies, losing me a life and drawing me a card. The Blitz Requisitioner dies as well, which draws Benji a card, and Gnome's Dragon dies, and the copy of the Marauder dies as well. Finally, Benji's Facebreaker triggers because damage was dealt to a player, and he creates a treasure token. Moving to end step, Benji's Lulu triggers, and Benji passes the turn. I untap, draw, and play a Swamp. I pay 2 for a Selfless Spirit of my own. I then follow that up by paying 4 for a Ravenous Chupacabra, choosing to have it destroy the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki on its ETB. I then tap my 2 remaining lands to cast a Mirror Shield. Wanting to leave my Lulu up as a potential blocker, I then pass my turn to Gnome. Gnome untaps, draws, and plays a Plains. He starts off his turn by equipping the Robe of Stars to his commander. Wanting to beef up his Lion Sash, Gnome then exiles the Fable of Mirrorbreaker from Benji's graveyard, the Novice Occultist from my graveyard, and the Marsh Flats and Soul Ring from Ginger's graveyard. In response to the Soul Ring being targeted, Ginger removes 2 counters from her Crawler, giving her 2 mana. She then sacrifices her Scrap Trawler to her background Clan Crafter, drawing her a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on her commander. When Scrap Trawler hits the graveyard, Ginger returns the Soul Ring to hand. With the Soul Ring no longer being a target, Gnome pays 3 more to exile the Scrap Trawler from Ginger's graveyard, the Felsteiner from my graveyard, and the Coastline Marauders from Benji's graveyard. With the newly buffed Lion Sash, Gnome pays 2 and reconfigures it onto his Lulu. With possible lethal on the board, Gnome moves to combat. He then swings his 9/11 double striking Hollyphant at Benji. In response to attackers being declared, Benji sacrifices a treasure to his treasure cove in hopes of drawing an answer. Unable to find something, Benji then sacrifices a treasure to his Facebreaker and exiles a sad robot off the top of his library. Unable to find an answer, Benji blocks Gnome's Lulu with his own Lulu. Benji's Lulu dies and is put back into the command zone. On Gnome's end step, Ginger taps her Crawler to give itself a +1/+1 counter. With no other actions, the turn then passes to Ginger. Ginger untaps, draws, and during her upkeep gains a life thanks to her Inventor's Fire. Ginger then taps her Noble Purse and removes a counter from it in order to create a treasure token. She then recasts her Soul Ring for free thanks to her Foundry Inspector. Because 2 artifacts enter Ginger's battlefield, her Cannoneer gets 2 more counters and is unblockable until the end of turn. Ginger sacrifices her treasure token and pays 2 mana for an Arc-bound Reclaimer. Reclaimer enters with 2 +1/+1 counters and also triggers Cannoneer, giving it another counter. Ginger follows that up by paying 1 for a significantly discounted Thought Monitor, letting Ginger draw 2 cards and put another counter on Kappa. Moving to combat, Ginger sends her 13/13 unblockable Canyoneer at Benji and her 5/4 Lulu at Gnome. Seeing as neither player is able to block, Benji takes 13 damage and Gnome takes 5 commander damage. In her post-combat main phase, Ginger taps her Crawler to give itself another counter and taps her Giver to give Lulu protection from white. Ginger then pays 2, sacrifices her Thought Monitor to her Clan Crafter, drawing her a card and putting an additional +1/+1 counter on her commander. Ginger then moves to her end step and her Lulu triggers, putting +1/+1 counters on each of her tapped creatures, and then she is able to untap them. She then passes the turn to Benji. Benji untaps, draws, and plays a Plains. He pays 3 to cast an Ingenious Artillerist. He then pays 1 and casts an Ozolith. On ETB, each opponent loses 1 life from the Artillerist. Benji sacrifices a treasure to his Treasure Cove and draws a card. He then pays 3 and casts a Swashbuckler Extraordinaire. When it enters the battlefield, Benji creates a treasure and everyone takes 1 damage. Moving to combat, Benji swings his Professional Facebreaker at Gnome and his Coastline Marauders at Ginger. On attack, Benji uses his Swashbuckler's ability to sacrifice a treasure and give his Marauders double strike until end of turn. Ginger uses her Kappa to block the Marauders, and then before combat is dealt, she taps her Giver to give the Kappa protection from red. After damage is resolved, Gnome takes 2 damage and Benji's Marauder dies. Professional Facebreaker triggers, giving Benji another treasure. Each opponent takes 1 from the Artillerist trigger again. During his post-combat main phase, Benji minuses down his Wanderer to exile Ginger's tapped Giver of Ruins. In response, Ginger pays 5 for a Mystic Confluence. She chooses to return Giver to her hand, and then MTGGnome's commander to his hand to draw a card. Benji then passes the turn to me. I untap and draw for turn. I pay 3 for my background Criminal Past, and I follow that up by paying 2 for a Black Blade Reforge. And then I pay an additional 3 mana to equip it to my Lulu. With a dangerous and menacing Lulu on board, I move to combat and swing my 12/10 at Ginger. Ginger chooses not to block and takes 12 commander damage. All tapped out, I pass the turn to Gnome. Gnome untaps and draws. Gnome then floats 10 mana and casts a Bifrost having X equal to 5. He chooses to target the Swiftfoot Boots and Gorgon Flail from my battlefield, the Ozolith from Benji's battlefield, and the Soul Rain and Kappa Canyoneer from Ginger's battlefield, using his remaining 4 mana to pay the Kappa's ward cost. In response, Ginger taps her Crawler to add a counter, then removes 2 counters to create 2 mana, and then she uses 2 of that mana to sacrifice her Soul Rain to her Clan Crafter, drawing her a card and adding a +1/+1 counter to her commander. She then sacrifices her Selfless Spirit, giving all of her creatures indestructible until end of turn. On MTGGnome's end step, Ginger removes a counter from her Arcbound Reclaimer and puts her Soul Rain on top of her library. Unable to effectively get through Ginger's board state, Gnome passes the turn. Ginger untaps, draws, and gains a life from her Inventor's Fair. She recasts Soul Rain and puts a +1/+1 counter on her Kappa and gives it unblockable until end of turn. She then plays a Core Haven as land for turn. Paying 6, Ginger casts an Ugin the Ineffable, which makes colorless spells cost 2 less to cast. Ginger then, thanks to the Foundering Spectre and Ugin, casts a Steel Overseer for free, adding another counter to Kappa. She follows it up by paying 3 for a Lunvala Shield of Seagate. Ginger taps her Noble's Purse, removing the last counter from it to create a treasure. This gives another counter to her Kappa. Using Ugin's -3 ability, Ginger targets my Lulu to be destroyed, not seeing my own Selfless Spirit on the battlefield. In response, I sacrifice my spirit to give my creatures indestructible until end of turn. Before going to combat, Ginger pays 1 and recasts her Giver of Ruins. During combat, Ginger sends her now 17/17 Kappa at Benji and her 8/7 Lulu at me. In response to attackers being declared, Benji sacrifices a treasure to his Facebreaker and exiles the top card off his library, revealing a mountain. Unable to stop the incoming damage, Benji passes priority. Combat damage is then dealt, knocking Benji out of the game and putting me at 19 life and 8 commander damage. During her second main phase, Ginger taps her Crawler and puts a +1/+1 counter on it. She then removes the counter for a mana and sacrifices her treasure for a second mana. She spends 2 mana to sacrifice her Noble's Purse to Clan Crafter, drawing Ginger a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on her commander. Ginger then casts a fully discounted Milliken and adds one more counter on Kappa. Ginger moves to instep and her Lulu triggers. I untap, draw, and play a tapped Scoured Barrens, gaining me 1 life. I then pay 3 and tap to sacrifice my Great Hall of Starnheim to create a white 4/4 Angel Warrior token with Vigilance. I then pay 2 and equip my Lulu with the Mirror Shield. Moving to combat, I swing my Lulu at Ginger. Since my commander has Menace, Ginger double blocks with her Linvala and her commander. Before combat damage is dealt, Ginger sacrifices her Linvala to give her other creatures indestructible until end of turn. During my second main phase, I pay 3 to cast a Victimize, choosing to sacrifice my Chupacabra and target my Selfless Spirit, bringing it back to the battlefield tapped. However, we learned later that I actually had to have 2 targets in the graveyard and couldn't just target 1 card for the spell to resolve, so technically I couldn't have done this, but it doesn't change the outcome of the game. Anyways, on my end step, my Lulu triggers, untapping itself, adding a +1/+1 counter. I then pass the turn to Gnome. Gnome untaps and draws. He pays 2 to cast a Stoneforge Mystic, searching up a Trailblazer's Boots, revealing it and putting it into his hand. He then pays 4 to reconfigure the Lion Sash and Lizard Blades onto Noel. He casts the Trailblazer Boots and equips them onto Noel, giving Noel non-basic land walk. Lastly, Gnome equips Noel with the Robe of Stars. Moving in combat, Gnome swings his suited up Noel at Ginger. In response, Ginger pays 2 and taps her Core Haven to prevent Noel from dealing combat damage this turn. On instep, Ginger taps her Crawler to add a counter to it. Unable to get through Ginger's defenses, Gnome passes the turn. Ginger untaps, draws, and gains a life from her Inventor's Fair. She then pays 4 and sacrifices her Inventor's Fair to search up an Ozolith, putting it into her hand. She then casts the Ozolith, putting a counter on Kappa and making it unblockable. Ginger plays a Bant Panorama as land for turn, and then she taps her Steel Overseer to put a +1/+1 counter on each of her artifact creatures. Ginger taps her Milliken for a colorless mana, milling a card in the process, and then pays an additional mana to sacrifice her Milliken to Clancrafter, drawing her a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on Lulu. The counter from the Milliken is put onto the Ozolith. She then sacrifices her Foundry Inspector to the Clancrafter, drawing a card and adding a counter to Lulu. The 2 counters from the Inspector are put onto the Ozolith. Moving to combat, Ginger moves the counters on the Ozolith onto her commander, making Lulu now a 15/14. Before she declares attackers, Ginger taps her Giver of Runes to give her Lulu protection from white. Ginger swings her Lulu has protection from white at me and her unblockable Canyoneer, along with Claimer and Crawler at Gnome. I have no response and neither does Gnome, so I take a lethal amount of commander damage and Gnome dies from the onslaught of all the artifact creatures. And with that, Ginger wins the game. GG! Alright, I hope you had a blast watching on this Lulu shindigs. I don't know, they're going bonkers. It was really funny writing the script because I would be like, Ginger casts Lulu, Benji casts Lulu, I cast Lulu, and just going with all of that was really fun and silly. So usually at the end of the game we like to call out like MVPs and stuff like that, or at least a really cool card that really stood out. And I think we can all agree at the end of that game, Captain Canyoneer was very, very strong and deserves a shout out. Something else too that I thought was just really fun was I think everyone just really took creative directions, and even though all 4 of us brought the same commander, all of our decks played super differently. So I highly recommend just going to take a little browse at some of the deck lists also in the description below and just see like all the cool synergies that people thought of, because this game again was just an absolute blast. So thank you again to Ginger and Benji and MTGGnome for heckin' making this possible, but also a huge thank you to Ken who wrote the script for this. And another big thank you to Olivia, who also, edited all this. And if you've noticed some cool animations and stuff like that, that's been her. So thank you to everyone. And yeah, hope you tune in for the next episode. And I guess, goodbye.